Florida's housing market is on the verge of collapse, and I think home prices in Florida could go down by as much as 30% over the next couple years. Because right now, Florida's housing market is a massive 31% overvalued, which makes it the 5th most overvalued housing market in America. And I fear for many of the people who are buying in Florida's housing market right now, who have bought recently, because a lot of them don't remember what happened to Florida in the last housing crash from 2008 to 2012. Did you know that home prices in Florida went down 50% in that last downturn? If you bought a house in Miami in 2007 for $500,000, it was worth $250,000 5 years later. Now, I don't think this crash is going to be as bad. It's going to be more like 30%. But what scares me is that I see a lot of people in Florida who somehow think that that can't happen. They think that Florida's housing market is untouchable and that so many people will continue to move there and keep the housing market growing. And no doubt, a lot of people have moved to Florida. 440,000, in fact, in 2022, according to data from Reventure app. That was an all-time high level in Florida migration. However, what do you notice, everyone? If you go back to the mid-2000s, Florida had a similar spike in migration, and then that migration crashed down during the recession. And as I'm going to show you in this video, I think those migration numbers to Florida are already plummeting right now. We haven't seen it in the official data. We will soon, and that's a big problem because the local home buyers in Florida cannot afford houses and mortgage payments. Folks, I want you to think about this. The median household in Florida earns $64,000 a year. In Miami, Fort Lauderdale, it's $66,000. In Northport, Sarasota, it's $70,000. In Tampa, St. Pete, it's $64,000. In Orlando, it's $68,000. In Lakeland, it's $57,000. So Florida is a pretty low income place, which now has home prices and house payments that are too high. Which you can see if I switch this data point on Reventure app to house payment as percentage of median income, you can see some crazy figures. Basically in Florida, if you're a local who wants to buy a house, you need to spend between 40 and 50% of your income on mortgage interest, taxes, and insurance. Quite literally, Florida is now just as expensive for local home buyers as Massachusetts, as New York, as Utah, as well as parts of California. It's lost its affordability allure, which a lot of actually wealthier people are now starting to notice. For instance, Peter Thiel just went on record in saying that moving to Florida from Silicon Valley is too expensive. He wouldn't do it. He's saying that if you buy a house in Miami today versus just 3 years ago, you're paying 4 times as much for your monthly mortgage payment. Florida used to be cheap, it's no longer cheap, and thus fewer people are going to want to move there, the migration is going to go down, and the housing market's going to have a downturn. This is in fact healthy and something we are already seeing playing out, with Redpin reporting that demand for vacation homes is down more than 50% from pre-pandemic levels. You can see the big increase in mortgage rate locks for second and vacation homes that occurred in 2020 and 2021. Well, that is now crashed to its lowest level since 2015 or 2016. And Florida, of course, has some of the most second and vacation home buying of any state in America. That's something that really runs the Florida housing market. So a big drop in that type of demand is going to cause inventory to go up. I'm sure you're all hearing about and frustrated by low inventory on the US housing market, but Florida is actually a state that does not have low inventory. In fact, the number of homes for sale on the Florida housing market, according to data from Realtor.com on Reventure app, is up 116% year over year. What do you notice, folks? Florida's inventory growth is actually the highest in America. There's more than 2 times as many homes on the Florida housing market today than there were a year ago. The biggest growth in inventory, Utah's number 2, Tennessee's number 3, Arizona's number 4, South Carolina's number 5. So if you're a would-be home buyer in Florida, pay attention to this data. I'm showing you, everyone, inventory is way up, second home buying is way down. We have big people in tech and finance saying they wouldn't move to Florida because it's too expensive, all occurring in a housing market that's one of the most overvalued and unaffordable for local home buyers in America, meaning that it's still a bad time to buy. Of course, I know a lot of you have been waiting a long time to buy in Florida, and I originally said 6 to 9 months ago that Florida's housing market would crash. Maybe it started to have a downturn, but it hasn't crashed yet. A lot of you are getting frustrated, waiting, and I know a lot of you just are going to buy at some point, and so a lot of you want to know when. When is the shoe going to drop? When is this going to go from theory to reality in Florida's housing market? And I'm going to tell you, folks, it's going to have a lot to do with the broader macro economy. Florida's housing market is very cyclical. It runs off the tail end of economic growth. So when we're at the very end of an expansion, Florida's economy is booming. The unemployment rate is low, and it seems like everything's going to go up forever. But folks, once that unemployment rate in America starts going up, Florida is going to feel the effects very, very fast because its economy runs off tourism. And when things get tough for Americans, a lot of them are going to say, I'm going to postpone that trip to Florida until next year, which is going to lead to an increase in unemployment and decrease in wages for the people working in Florida, and then increase mortgage defaults, delinquencies, and foreclosures, and push inventory up even more. And one market I already see this starting to happen in is Miami. Data from STR, the hotel company, shows that Miami hotels have actually seen a 16% decline in revenue year over year, while revenue across US hotels more broadly is up 6%. So why is Miami hotel revenue down 16% when America hotel revenue is still up 6%? I can tell you why. Fewer people are going to Miami. Fewer people with money are going to Miami. And that is now starting to make ripples in the Miami economy, but the unemployment rate in Miami is still low. It's actually a record low, 2.2%. So we're not seeing mass layoffs yet, but what do you notice about the history of Miami's economy, everyone? Well, obviously during the pandemic, there was a big recession, 14% unemployment when the lockdowns happened. But go back to 2010, Miami's unemployment rate in the last downturn went to 11% from a low, again, of about 2.1%. So if you were in Miami in the middle of 2007, at the beginning of the last crash, you'd be like, oh wow, nothing bad's gonna happen to this market, and then boom, 4 times as many unemployed people. And I'm not saying this to scare anyone, I'm not saying this to be a downer. I just wanna make sure that if you're a home buyer or real estate investor in Miami or Florida, you understand what you're getting into, because there's so much, excuse my language, BS spewing about what Florida's housing market is. So many people try to trick you into thinking that it's this stable housing market that's just gonna weather the storm. No. That's not what Florida is. It has never been that. Now, real quick, I'm going to do a rapid fire round where I'm going to run through the 10 cities and housing markets that I think are most overvalued in Florida. To access this data, go to Reventure app, scroll in on Florida, and then change the data point to undervalued percentage. What do you see here? Well, a market like Miami, Fort Lauderdale is 32% overvalued. The typical home value there now is $451,000. The fair value based on underlying incomes is $300,000. I'm seeing big declines now in Miami given how much prices have gone up over the last 6 to 12 months. Additionally, Tampa St. Pete is 33% overvalued, and a market like Jacksonville is 31% overvalued. If you want to look at a list here of the most overvalued housing markets in Florida, you can as well by hitting table view, and you can see we have some smaller ones that are more overvalued, more volatility, but then Punta Gorda is one that's 35% overvalued, Lakeland's 34% overvalued. We talked about Tampa, we talked about Miami. You got Northport at 32%, Crestview at 31%, Ocala at 31%. And so the more overvalued your housing market is, the more that home prices have a potential to crash. And really, the big issue in Florida is that home prices have gone up way more than incomes over the last 3 years. And that's ultimately the telltale sign of a bubble. It's what happened in 2007 before the 50% crash in Florida, and it's what's happening right now. For instance, in Jacksonville, the typical home value of $353,000 is 5 times the median income of $70,000. You could see that's the highest level of overvaluation in Jacksonville's history, even higher than 2007 before the worst housing crash of all time where prices went down 50%. So what does that say to you in Jacksonville? Well, either values need to go down or incomes need to go up to bring this value to income ratio back closer to the long run average. Same thing in Pensacola on the Panhandle. The value to income ratio today is 4.4. Again, saying that Pensacola is the most expensive it's ever been relative to how much money people make there. Previous peak was 3.7. Long-term average is 3.1. That implies we have maybe 25% downside in Pensacola's housing market for prices. How about Naples? The value to income ratio in Naples is 7.6. This is like a California level value to income ratio in terms of how unaffordable it is for locals. The long-term average is 5.6. And what do you notice? The last time value to income in Naples was this high was 0607 before a big crash. What about in Cape Coral? Well, the value to income ratio is 5.7. The long-term average is 4.1, which basically it was at for the last 5 to 6 years before the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit, values exploded, similar to how they exploded in 06. What do we think is going to happen? I think there could be a 25% decline in prices. Now, if some of you are looking at buying a house in Florida right now, you might still be seeing bidding wars. You might still be seeing home prices going up, especially exiting the spring, which is typically a peak time of year in Florida's housing market. But I suspect as the summer and the fall rolls on, we're going to start to see the realities of this overvaluation data start to overtake Florida's housing market. And I think we're going to start to see more substantial price declines over the next 3 to 6 months. One thing I would encourage you guys to also look at is inventory levels. I talked about before how inventory in Florida has grown more than any state in America over the last year. And in a metro like Ocala, inventory has surged with over 2,000 homes on the market, which is now above the pre-pandemic level of inventory. Again, that's all data you can find on Reventure app. Here's my mission here, folks. I don't want to dissuade you from buying a house as a home buyer in Florida in 2023. I just want you guys to have access to as much data information as possible so you can make a better decision. And I suspect if you see in your market that inventory is way up and it's still 30% overvalued, you're probably going to decide it's time to wait. But ultimately, that's your decision. I know different people have different timelines for buying. Some people have waited a long time and might just want to buy and get it over with because they know they're going to hold for the long term. And that's the thing about the housing market, everyone. If you buy a house, the idea that you're going to hold it for 10 years or more than 10 years, you can ride out a downturn. Typically, a housing crash like the last one in Florida took 5 years for home prices to go down 50%. But theoretically, if you own it long enough, you can ride out that downturn and the prices go up. However, the problem in Florida is that I think also the long-term prospects for Florida's housing market aren't so great. And that has to do with the demographic freight train that's about to hit Florida's housing market. What I mean by that is the age of Florida's population. For instance, the median age in Florida, according to data on Reventure app, is 42. Now you could see that's one of the oldest states in America. The only other states that are comparable in terms of age are West Virginia, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So Florida has a lot of older homeowners, especially in a market like Punta Gorda, where the median age is 60, or in Northport, where it's 53, or in the Villages, where it's 68. And in the short term, having an older homeowner population is good because older homeowners typically don't move. Like they'll buy a house and they'll keep the house, and they might even eventually buy like an investment property. So over the last 10 to 15 years, having an older homeowner population for Florida has been good for its housing market. But now as the baby boomer population ages, some of the oldest baby boomers are coming close to 80 years old, we're unfortunately going to see a lot of homeowners in Florida exit their homes and move into nursing homes and unfortunately pass away. When that happens, they will either pass down their houses to their kids, or most likely the houses will get sold in estate sales, which at a certain point will be like a perpetual flow of inventory onto the Florida housing market. It's not going to be all at once, but over 5 years, over 10 years, over 15 years, over 20 years, there's just going to be more and more homes hitting Florida's housing market due to this aging of the homeowner population. And an additional problem due to the age of Florida is they're not like regenerating their population organically. With the number of births in Florida in 2022 being below the level that it was in the mid-2000s, while the number of deaths, the red line, has now surged to record levels. So in Florida, literally for 3 years in a row, there have now been more deaths than births. Some of that had to do to the COVID pandemic, but you could see this trend was already going in that direction before the pandemic, and it will get worse into the future as the baby boomer population begins to age. More deaths than births in Florida, which again highlights how the housing market in Florida is 100% reliant on maintaining huge levels of migration, which ultimately just are not sustainable to maintain, especially at the end of an economic cycle entering recession. And so that's why I'm bearish on Florida's housing market in both the short and long run. However, there are certain cities in Florida that, if you put a gun to my head and said, hey, Nick, where would you buy in Florida if you had to? There are certain cities in the long run that I think are going to do well. And by long run, I mean 5 to 10 years, maybe closer to 10 years, where I think if you buy in the next couple of years as the crash gets worse, you'll get good growth in the next 10 years. And for this, I'm targeting areas in Florida that are younger, that have more organic population growth. This is not ageist. This is simply looking at the areas that are likely to have the best organic growth. One would be Orange County in Orlando. The median age is 35. Another would be Hillsborough County in Tampa. The median age is 38. Moving up to Duval County in Jacksonville, the median age is 36. Now, to be clear, these areas are all going to have a big crash, in my opinion, over the next couple of years. I wouldn't buy there today, but in the long run, I would target these younger areas in Florida because they're going to have better growth. Additionally, I think Miami-Dade County in the long run is a good place to buy, given that it's just going to have huge levels of immigration and population growth in the long run. So I would also add Miami-Dade County to my long-term list for Florida's housing market. And by long-term, I mean 10 years. Of course, I know a lot of you are going to disagree with me. So if you do, let me know in the comment section below. Let me also know what you're seeing as a home buyer in Florida in the spring and summer housing market in 2023. Are you seeing signs of the downturn yet? And lastly, if you want to access the data that I showed you in this video for free on overvaluation percentage, inventory, median age, you can go to www.reventure.app and you can access this data for free for any city, county, or zip code in America.